Welcome back to the show. This is LOL, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep itself from crying. I am your host, Craig Pasta Jardula from Pasta to Go. And with me today is my good friend and the professor himself. He teaches at Tulsa Community College, and he's also an author of many books, including his new one, Warmonger. You can see Bill Clinton's face back there if you're watching on one of our YouTube or Rumble channels. Ladies and gentlemen, the professor himself, Jeremy Kuzmarov, is here.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. And it was great doing a show on the campus of UCLA. Guys, if you want to go check it out, go to our Rumble, go to our YouTube, and you can see me and the professor on the campus covering the protests that were going on. Because it seems like no matter what, Professor, they always want to take us to war. Before we get started on this, I think you should lay out the importance of why we're going to go back and talk about the Vietnam War. Because, I was just a little puppy. I was born in 1973. But the country broke out and in mass protest, and it really happened when they saw these body bags coming back from Vietnam. And at one point, when they were filming that during the Iraq War, George W. Bush's regime ordered that no more footage. Dick Cheney said, Karl Rove said, no more footage of body bags coming back. But it seems like the United States, I don't know if we haven't gotten it down pat yet, that being we the people, on how to stop the ruling class from taking us to war. But it seems like they're doing it right now. It's very scary what Hakeem Jeffries talked about, possibly us having boots on the ground. Why is it important to go back to understand what happened in Vietnam, Professor?
Well, it's important to study the history to try and learn from it. I mean, it was a horrific war that caused millions of deaths. It was caused by thrusts for U.S. empire that we still see today. That what causes all these wars. Also caused by war profiteers who profit off of war. So I think it's important to understand that terrible history and to push back against the forces that caused that disaster then and are causing disasters now. And unfortunately, what we see with Vietnam is a very strong effort by the establishment to promote a revisionist history of Vietnam that sugarcoats aspects of the war, that distorts what really went on, what really drove the conflict, that distorts aspects of U.S. policy, and that denigrate the Vietnam era anti-war movement, which really was the only positive thing to come out of that war, and was very heroic in trying to oppose the war. And we need a similar movement today. But if they're constantly, demonizing that movement, like in films, and a lot of school don't even teach about it, and so young people or people today don't have anything positive to go off. And they think only negative things about the anti-war movement of the 60s and some of its excesses, which are always played up. And they're not going to participate in anti-war activism today. And that's really what we need.
I put some notes down just to kind of go over some of the things you're talking about. It's always about the name of empire, right? And war profiteering. Smedley Butler talked about this years ago in the beginning of the 1900s. And now we are here 2024 to this day. And we see all these companies making a ridiculous amount of money. It was like almost what Russell Brand had talked about when he was on Bill Maher when it came to the pharmaceutical industries, right? So if you have a company that completely profiteers and has control of the government, you're going to see a society which is always sick and they're going to have to present the cure all the time. Same thing with the war profiteers, right? If you have a conflict over there, if you're fighting for human rights, if you have a dictator that's putting the people, oppressing the people, well, then you can present a solution through the war machine. But I do think that there are some positive things that came out of Vietnam when it comes to the press. You have a press nowadays, and I often think about the New York Times, how it helped Dick Cheney sell the war in Iraq, right? They were probably trying to do the same thing during the Vietnam era, but then we have guys like Mike Gravel and Daniel Ellsbury, right, that came for the whistleblowers. So I think that there was proof back then that there is still real press versus fake press. Your thoughts on that when it comes to the press and the war and these guys coming out of it?
That's true. I think there was an opening of the press in that era. Even from an early period of the war, there were a reporter like David Halberstam, who wrote for the New York Times, who was questioning U.S. policy, and he was showing that the statements of government leaders were at odds with the reality in Vietnam, that the leader of the United States was supporting were corrupt, were not supported by the population. And that Halberstam even referred to South Vietnam as basically a creation of the United States. So we don't really have. And then later on, when there were correspondents there who were observing like the bombing, there were reports about the horrific human costs of the U.S. bombing operations. Or Seymour Hersh emerged in that period as a maverick reporter who exposed the My Lai massacre, and he was writing in mainstream publications, and that's what kind of triggered the anti-war movement. But Hersh has been blacklisted in old age. I mean, he's still doing great reporting, but now he has only his own Substack. He used to write for the New Yorker, and they blacklisted him, and you don't find him in the New York Times or Washington Post anymore, and you don't find the Halberstam types in those publications either, who are questioning U.S. policy, the nature of U.S. ally, the corruption, and exposing some of the lies of government leaders. We've just the media now is just an echo chamber of the State Department and CIA, and it's promoted a totally distorted picture of the war in Ukraine, for instance.
Well, let's talk about this film here that you brought to class today, Professor. Part 1, The Deja Vu, The Vietnam War, a film by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. Professor, why don't you tell us when this Ken Burns film was made, and what its reach and what its significance is? In other words, how many people had seen this? What was the significance of it? Give us everything and unpack what you got going on for us today, Professor.
Well, this is a very significant film in what I was discussing, the distortion and historical revisionism that's kind of sugarcoating the history and making the anti-war movement look like the bad guys and not U.S. war leaders per se. And this film has had a huge impact. And, Ken Burns is a great filmmaker. I think he had liberal sensibilities. He'd made some tremendous films, including about the Civil War and about baseball.
Baseball. He made great baseball movies.
It's a great movie. I really enjoyed his movie on baseball. So he really knows how to make a great film. The Civil War film was, pretty objective, critical history about the war and some of the, corruption in the seats of government leaders and other leaders at that time, including, of course, the Confederacy. But he's not uncritical of the U.S. government either at that time. So, I mean, he's capable of a very good historical analysis. But when it comes to Vietnam, I found and the film was he made this blockbuster Vietnam film. It was released in 2017. It was seen by 60 million people. Wow. It was on PBS. I believe it's used in a lot of college courses. And it was respected in the liberal establishment. It got favorable reviews in liberal media. But a critical scrutiny of the film find that it promotes this historical revisionism, that it has this kind of phony countercultural veneer, that it has a lot of the rock anthems of the 60s. But the film really denigrates the Vietnam anti-war movement. It makes it seem like U.S. leaders were honorable in intentions, ignored that they were running an empire, trying to expand American empire in Southeast Asia and manipulate the people of Vietnam. That's what a lot of veterans, we have great books by American soldiers who came back and critically reflected on their experiences and read more into the history. And that's what they said, that, they saw America was trying to manipulate Vietnam and mold the country to its liking and didn't really care about the interests of the people and just callously ended up slaughtering a lot of them. But you have this, at the beginning of the film, the narrator says, well, they were decent men with honorable intention or something like that who acted in good faith. Well, not really. And then it goes on from there. It distorts a lot of aspects of the film, and it really denigrates the Vietnam anti-war movement.
Professor, you have a couple clips that you want to play the show. You want to start with the first one here, and it's just kind of reiterate what you just said, and then play the second clip about the CIA disinformation?
Sure.
All right, let's take a look at it.
And what did you see, my darling?
It was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, American overconfidence, and Cold War miscalculation.
Yeah, so there's that statement, decent man, honorable intention, but there's no discussion of empire, and that, the U.S. really was trying to establish a military outpost to counter communist China. They wanted to establish military bases in Vietnam. Vietnam was, the liberation movement against France, who had colonized Vietnam, was led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, and he was favorable toward communist China. and the United States didn't want him, so they tried to engineer a new government in South Vietnam. They violated international protocols, and they were intent on establishing military bases there and integrating Vietnam's economy with Japan, because Japan was the junior partner in the Cold War strategy of containing China, and the U.S. had dozens of military bases in Japan and Okinawa. So really, it's about fortifying the U.S. empire in the Asia Pacific.
Professor, I just got to point out, it's the way with that statement, the way they try to sell you the war, right? They always try to rationalize it once again and make it look like this is something that's been going on before the even birth of America. The same way they're doing in Gaza today. Oh, this is a historic battle from back. They were fighting before we were even a country. And they try to sell you the war then, and they try to sell you the past. They try to rewrite the past. And that's what this is going on right now, this Ken Perns video. We'll play the second clip, but they're trying to sell you like it was a quagmire of sorts that we were just drawn into, fighting for human resources. It was honest men, but they do that so they can sell a future war, right? They try to whitewash the sins of the past.
Yeah,
that's a point of contention.
They say it was all just a misunderstanding, but it's not. They willfully went in there to try and engineer a government the people of that country didn't want, and then they used horrific violence to crush the will of the people when they fought back against that puppet regime.
They tell you, Professor, that they're fighting for human rights, but they're really just fighting for McDonald's to be built there. It's crazy. Let's play the next clip over here that you have, Professor, so you can explain a little bit more why it's important to catch what happened then and kind of relate to what's going on now, because they're going to try to sell you the next war, especially if they got away with selling you the last war. Here we are.
Diem became wildly popular because he seemed to embody the nationalist cause in the South. He succeeded in getting the French out of Vietnam all the way, and Ho Chi Minh had only got them out of the northern half.
So what is that? What's he stating right there now, and who's he talking about? Why is it important, Professor?
Okay, well, first, the person talking is named Rufus Phillips. He's a CIA officer. He's now deceased, from Texas. He worked under Edward Lansdale. Edward Lansdale was a key figure trying to engineer this regime in the South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, the figure you see, the South Vietnamese premier. Now, that was the Geneva Convention of 1954 had actually called for the unification of Vietnam and elections to reunify the country. But Dwight Eisenhower said Ho Chi Minh would win those elections by 80%. So the U.S. sabotaged the election and tried to support Diem. And there was a propaganda operation to make like Diem was this great leader. And actually, Lyndon Johnson said, the vice president under Kennedy, then president, said he was the Winston Churchill of Asia. But then privately, he told the reporter, damn, he's the only boy we've got out there. And I mean, Diem was like Zelensky today. They manufacture this image, and Phillips is continuing the propaganda effort. The CIA are specialists in psychological warfare and propaganda. So Phillips is continuing that in this film. He claims Diem was this great nationalist, and that he helped throw out the French in the South and Ho Chi Minh only in the North. But that's a totally false history. Diem was not, see, the first Indochina War, France tried to reclaim its colony after World War II. And they fought a war from 1946 to 1954, and they lost at Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh led the Viet Minh with the principal force fighting the French, and his guerrilla commander was Vo Nguyen Giap, who's a national hero. Diem, the U.S. proxy or U.S. boy, was not even in the country in those 8 years. He went to New Jersey at a monastery, and he was cultivating support from American politicians while Ho Chi Minh was leading his liberation struggle. It's as if George Washington leading the fight against the British, and some guy backed by France or Russia was in Moscow or Paris getting support of those politicians. And he had no support in Vietnam when they brought him in. Diem, he wasn't a great nationalist. He had no support. So what Phillips and Lansdale did was they paid for 1 million refugee Catholics in North Vietnam, because Diem was a Catholic. That was the other problem. Catholics were only 1% of the population. It's a mostly Buddhist country. So they paid Catholics in the North to move to the South to support his government, but that was still a total minority. And
Yeah. But you know what? I want to focus 1 second, though, Professor, really quickly before we continue to go on Rufus Phillips, because it reminds me. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones, the first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark. At the very end, they're like, "Well, who's working on this?" And it's top men. Like, who? Top men. And what do they always do to rewrite history? They bring in the CIA, bring in Rufus Phillips and his other guys. They want to, I was just recently on a panel where some conservatives, right wingers, were justifying the atomic bomb, and you get people like this Rufus Phillips who will justify what happened, our behavior back then, to justify the next war. It's always about, we're actually playing the Captain Americas. We're fighting for human rights and truth and justice. And it just amazes me how they can bring in these people in the CIA. And like I said, the left used to be pushed back against the CIA. Now they completely have on their networks ex-CIA heads of CIAs like the Clappers and the Brennans. I want to concentrate on Burns' portrayal of the anti-war movement in this film. How would you classify it? Because when we see these tactics of bringing in the top men CIA to explain why we did things, it makes me just think it's just a whole bunch of propaganda pieces, and it makes me not want to watch this film on baseball.
Yeah, and I should add about Phillips. Yeah, he makes it seem so heroic what the Americans are doing, and at the end is such a good guy. But this guy ran a torture. What happened is that he ignited a huge rebellion among the population that was brutally stamped out with CIA support. And he ran a torture chamber under the Saigon Zoo, and he passed a law where people could be executed after a secret military tribunal. And that's what ultimately led to the Vietnam War. And he triggered these famous Buddhist protests where the Buddhists went so far as to immolate themselves to protest the huge violence and repression of his government that people like Phillips had helped to engineer and now are trying to tell us was that he was a hero. And then the film goes on to denigrate the anti-war movement, to make it look like they spat on soldiers who came back, which is false. That is an urban legend. My friend Jerry Lemke, who's a Vietnam veteran, wrote a great book called The Spitting Image, Myth, Memory, and the Legacy of Vietnam. And he researched this and found no documented cases of anti-war activists spitting on veterans. And actually what he discusses in his book is how so many Vietnam veterans turned against the war because it was such a bad war, and they joined forces with the Vietnam-era anti-war movement to try and put a stop to it. And Burns makes it seem like soldiers, when they came home, that anti-war activists were protesting and abusing the soldiers. But he actually only shows the footage he provides is of protests outside ROTC on college campuses. He can't actually find any footage where anti-war activists are protesting veterans, because they were not against the veteran. They knew they were draftees, and they're just young men who grew up in the same America as them. They weren't against them. They were against the war makers, the Rufus Phillips types, the McNamaras, the Johnsons. That's who the target of their protest. And they protested outside ROTC because they didn't want young boys going to Vietnam, and they didn't want the universities encouraging militarism. But they weren't protesting veterans or mean to them.
Did they use any tactics back then of trying to kind of misrepresent the protesters themselves the way they're doing it today? Like those protesters we see in UCLA. I mean, I even pointed out some of the stuff about the mask and the COVID testing that we're a little bit maybe off, but whatnot. At the end of the day, I think the protesters themselves are genuinely doing the right thing. They're standing up for, I believe, the right side of history to stop an ethnic cleansing and whatnot. Were there any type of other distortions in the Ken Burns movie, or would you also remember any type of those same tactics that they're using today they used back then?
Yeah, well, what's distorted about the Ken Burns film is that it spotlights any excesses. Some of the protests, most of the anti-Vietnam War protests were very peaceful. The people were very honorable in their intention of trying to stop this horrific war. But the film spotlights a few excesses, like in some protests, any protest can sometimes get out of control. You have a few people turn over a car or smash a window, but that really doesn't give the flavor of the whole movement. Just like we were discussing with the Palestine movement, the article in Consortium News said 97% of the campus protests were peaceful. But if the media just spotlights the 1 or 2 or 3% where there's some incidents of vandalism, it gives a distorted picture. And that's what Burns does in his film. He interviews people who lament that somebody smashed a car or punctured a tire or something, or committed some petty vandalism. And that gives you a very negative impression of the movement. And they don't really go into some of the critiques or luminaries of that movement who are really heroic people. I mean, the Berrigan brothers, for instance, were very principled religious figures who went to prison. And, Ellsberg.
You talked about Operation Phoenix before, Professor. You want to talk a little bit more about that right now? What that was?
Sure. Yeah. And that's also distorted in the film, because the film does show that there was an Operation Phoenix, but makes it seem like the abuses of that program was because of some of these South Vietnamese soldiers went out of control and tortured captives. When in fact, what they don't address is that Phoenix was a systemic program, and then they're doing a Phoenix in Ukraine today to basically identify, using computerized blacklists that the CIA helped to develop. They compiled lists of subversives. In the case of the Vietnam War, it was the Viet Cong, or the guerrilla movement in South Vietnam backed by the North. They actually come to control all of the country, and they were running a lot of the provinces and cities. So, but there were officials who were running the governments, or there were shadow governments that would set up that were the real government when you had this kind of puppet regime. So remember, those shadow governments or the official government in provinces like town mayors or city officials, they were put, if they were loyal to the Viet Cong, they were put on these blacklists, and then the U.S. agents, South Vietnamese military forces who were agents of the United States, would then arrest them. And in many cases, they just assassinated them, or in other cases, they tortured them, sometimes in plain sight. Now, the film acknowledges that abuses went on, but it attributes again to cowboy. They quote a Phoenix operative who said it was cowboys in the PRU. PRU is provincial reconnaissance units, that these South Vietnamese proxies. But it wasn't just cowboy. I mean, the Americans were acting as cowboy. They've promoted torture for many, many years in CIA torture manuals, and they set up the whole Phoenix apparatus, and they were actually tabulating the statistics, including of killing. They were happy when people got killed, and they were encouraging killings and assassinations. And William Colby admitted at least 20,000 people got killed under Phoenix.
Well, you kind of already laid out the underlying agenda behind the movie. This movie by Ken Burns, a Vietnamese movie, a historical piece that seems a little twisted, had 60 million views. But who funded the film at the end of the day? So we know who's behind the distortion itself.
Exactly. That's an important question. And Burns gave an interview to the New York Times, and he admitted that he got funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, from the Ford Foundation, and from the Koch brothers. So if we go through all three, Rockefeller is the one of the richest dynasties in American history, who's historically funded a lot of the CIA front operations and corporations. The Ford Foundation is intricately tied to the CIA. A lot of in fact, one of their directors, McGeorge Bundy, served in the Kennedy-Johnson White House and was a key architect of the Vietnam War. And this was the philanthropic arm of the CIA, as somebody called it. And I think the Ford admitted its goal had been to co-opt left-wing intellectuals and any intellectual life in the United States, and to undermine any left-wing movements. And that's really the goal of this film, because it undercuts the analysis that the anti-war movement had developed about the criminality of the Vietnam War, and denigrates the anti-war movement and new left movement. And then the Koch brothers are tied to the oil industry and Republican far right, and the oil industry profited massively off the Vietnam War.
Professor, I think I have to cut you off because we're out of time, because they were doing it then, they're doing it now. This is LOL, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying.